This is a particularly exciting topic from my standpoint, 30 by 30, but what does that mean for those of you unfamiliar? It refers to protecting 30% of a state, a country, or the earth, both the lands and the waters in a natural state by the year 2030. It grew out of a thesis by Dr. Edward O. Wilson of Harvard that to head off the biodiversity and the extinction crisis, we needed to protect half the earth. That was 50% of the earth by 2050. But 2050 is a long way off, and you can't really tell what kind of progress you're making if it's still, 30 years in the future. So for that reason, people established an interim goal that they could be much more held accountable to. And that's where 30 by 30 came from. And it's being widely adopted. It's now the official policy of the state of California. The Biden administration has adopted it. When the G7 industrialized nations met, they adopted 30 by 30. And it's going to be debated and considered this fall when the Congress of the Parties meets for the Convention on Biological Diversity in Kunming, China, as possibly being the new global policy. If that's the way it goes, it's going to really help make this thing happen in a big way. First, let me say that at first blush, protecting half the earth for nature just sounds unrealistic and audacious. How in the world could we possibly do that? But from my perspective, and hopefully your perspective as well, it's really the height of arrogance and hubris to promote an idea that one single species, mankind, should be able to dominate and degrade and occupy over half the earth for itself, and then leave less than half for the remaining millions of species on the planet. So E.O. Wilson's idea of nature needs half is actually a modest proposal. It's a commitment to recognize that man is a part of nature, is dependent on nature, and for our own well-being and survival, we need to be promoting 30 by 30 and 50 by 50. The good news is that the Biden-Harris administration is publicly committed to this 30 by 30 goal. And it's not just rhetoric. They've directed all their federal agencies to work together to develop a plan to achieve this ambitious goal. Similarly, there's a lot of support and leadership in Congress, all coming from the Democratic side, where there are bills introduced in both the House and the Senate that hopefully will be moving forward. So this isn't something that can be undone by a future administration if by chance, a non-conservation oriented administration were to take over, but it could be the law of the land. Similarly, it's growing momentum at the state level. I said that California had adopted this. Governor Gavin Newsom issued an executive order for state agencies to implement 30 by 30. And similar 30 by 30 bills are now moving forward in such diverse states as Nevada and New York. But in this very highly partisan time, there's also major backlash coming primarily from Republicans in the congressional level and from red states. So, for example, Representative Lauren Boebert, you may have heard of her. She's a QAnon supporter representing Western Colorado. She's introduced a 30 by 30 Termination Act in Congress that has a couple dozen co-sponsors in the House. And again, they basically want to outlaw any implementation of 30 by 30. The right-wing think tanks, the right-wing media, and other anti-environmental NGOs have been decrying 30 by 30 as some kind of government overreach or a federal land grab. Right now the legislature in Nebraska, of all places, and the governor there are trying to outlaw 30 by 30, saying that it's going to privatize all the private land that's it's going to make public all the private land that's in Nebraska. Nothing could be further from the truth. But to complicate this, there's also deep divisions within the environmental community on this. Some environmental advocates argue that if you're trying to protect 30% for nature, that really needs to be protected. That means it needs to be a wilderness area or a national park or a state park wilderness or a wild river, but it's inadequate to turn around and say that you could have some conservation easements on some private land and somehow call that protected. So this debate is going on. The Biden administration on May 6th issued an initial report that was called the America the Beautiful Initiative. And that launched their 10-year effort, 10-year being from 2020 till 2030, to ultimately succeed in this 30 by 30 effort. And they would count within that 30% voluntary efforts by farmers and ranchers and private woodlot operators who implement conservation practices that benefit wildlife and sequester carbon to address the climate crisis. It would promote nearby nature parks to help serve nature-deprived communities. So it's a very different vision than just saying it's only national parks and wilderness areas. All these efforts are very urgent and laudable and necessary, but the question remains, should working landscapes be counted in the 50% that's set aside for nature, or should in fact private landowners, whether they're farmers, ranchers, woodlot owners, whatever it is, shouldn't they be practicing conservation already on the lands that aren't set aside strictly for nature? So that also gets to be a question that people need to wrestle with, is what level of conservation commitment and what term of conservation commitment is necessary before you could really turn around and count it as something that is dedicated to nature in perpetuity so that it counts against the nature needs have. Now, some environmentalists have accused the Biden-Harris administration of bait and switch. They basically said they campaigned talking about how they supported 30 by 30 and the Sierra Club and the, other environmental groups turned around and lauded it and said, this is wonderful. And then when they got in office, they issued this America the Beautiful initiative. And it looked like suddenly everybody was going to get credit for just doing low-till agriculture and getting a conservation reserve payment for a single year through the Farm Bill. So that is the big debate that's going on right now on the environmental side. The Sierra Club approach is that it doesn't really need to be one or the other. We need it all. So we need to have more fully protected areas. There are new national parks, new wilderness areas, new wildlife refuges that have the strictest level of protection. But we also need to be dealing with the state and private land situation, the kinds of things that Save Mount Diablo specializes in, because you can see the great climate benefits and open space benefits and wildlife and biodiversity protection benefits that come from the efforts of a wonderful group like Save Mount Diablo. So it's all needed that way. The other thing is that if you look at where the real potential is for new national parks and new wilderness areas, it's primarily on the federal lands, which are primarily in the West, beyond the 100th meridian. And if you really want to protect biodiversity, you can't just rely on federal lands and you can't just rely on the West, because some of the most biodiverse areas in the country and the most threatened areas from a biodiversity standpoint are on private lands and are on the Midwest and the South and the East, California coast and elsewhere. And so that becomes a key factor to weigh into all this. In the United States, where I'm going to focus primarily on tonight, to see what we can do to help contribute to this global 30 by 30 effort, the US Geological Survey projects that at this point, about 12% of our lands are protected and could be counted against that 30% goal of land protection. And about 23% of the coastal waters are protected. That's because we have some large marine reserves that are off the coast. But to put 30 by 30 in perspective, to get from 12% up to 30% just in the land mass, that means in the next 10 years, we would need to protect for nature over 400 million acres. That's twice the size of Texas. It also means that in 10 short years, now 9.5 years, we would need to protect more land than the conservation community working in partnership with others have protected over the last 150 years. We basically need to protect, 50 million acres every year, year after year after year. And when you consider that there's no guarantee that you are going to have a pro-environmental Congress and a pro-environmental president and pro-environmental leadership at the state level for all of those 10 years, you really need to get your act together and strike while the iron's hot. Now, the picture's more promising in a state like California. Here, we've already protected 22% of the lands and 16% of the state waters. So we're closer to that 30% target. But one of the things we need to remember there is that the lands that are protected are primarily rocks and ice in the Sierra Nevada, federal lands, and we still have to deal with all the private lands, all the wildlife migration corridors, all the threatened coastal areas that aren't in federal hands, and you can't just turn around and do a congressional designation on them. So it gets to be more of a problem there. The other thing is that it's not good enough for a state like California to just get to 30% and say, we're done, because a state like Iowa doesn't really have the opportunity to protect 30%. So Nevada, which is over 90% public land, needs to get far greater than 30% protected. And similarly with California. So we ought to be shooting far higher than a 30% target. But those eastern, southern, midwestern ecosystems are every bit as important, if not more important, if we're going to head off the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis. And so as a result, it's really important that if you're in a place like California and a place like the Bay Area, that you work in your own backyard through Save Mount Diablo and other groups like that in order to help meet the goal. But you also help us go figure out how to go save these other areas, because we aren't going to stave off either the climate crisis or the biodiversity crisis just by working in our own backyards. The Sierra Club has an aggressive plan of how to get to 30 by 30. So even though I've described to you how difficult, how daunting it is, and how perhaps impossible it is, I want to show you a little PowerPoint presentation here and walk you through about how the Sierra Club thinks that this is not the impossible dream. We aren't just tilling windmills, and we can make this happen if we all pull together. There is a clear path forward. You know, people used to think, gosh, the Sierra Club, Bruce Hamilton, John Muir, all these people saved all this land. Now we can just go enjoy it. You know, they've saved 280 million acres. Well, got news for you. We've got to save another 500 million acres. There's plenty of things for the next generation and the next generation after that to do to try to make sure that we're really protecting every ecosystem and all living things on Earth and God's creation. So with that in mind, let's switch to the PowerPoint here and I'll walk you through. I'm not going to read everything on there, but it's got some key graphics that I think are very useful. So if you can pop to the first slide that has some content rather than just saying what 30 by 30 is. Thank you. So the point of this slide is to show that this is a combined crisis. People are very familiar with the climate crisis. It's hitting us every day with tornadoes and wildfires and flooding and hurricanes, but it's integrally linked with a mass extinction crisis. And people think those are two separate things and you can work on them separately. But in fact, the climate crisis leads to the mass extinction crisis. And you can't solve the mass extinction crisis if you haven't solved the climate crisis. The third leg of this stool is called a nature equity gap. And that basically refers to the fact that everybody needs access to clean air, clean water, open space, and the healing benefits of nature. But in fact, it's disproportionately distributed in this country. Affluent white people tend to have more access to city parks and other open space, and there's other disadvantaged communities that have never been to the public lands. They've never been to the seashore. They've never seen wildlife like most of you have. And so it's really important as you're promoting 30 by 30 that you not only look at just how to address the climate crisis and mass extinction, but you're also trying to find key areas that can be protected that both help protect nature, but also help close this nature equity gap. Next slide. And then it all needs to be founded in principles of equity and justice. For the last 150 plus years, the conservation community, starting with John James Audubon, Madison Grant, John Muir, all these founders of various conservation groups, basically went out and protected land that they thought was beautiful, scenic, had great recreation potential, and they paid no attention to the indigenous populations whose land it was stolen from them and who still had binds to there and who still existed and should have a say in the future of that land. And similarly, other local communities should have a say in it. And for too long, they just operated in a blind alley and just said the important thing is to protect land and protect it for wildlife and protect it for recreation. And they didn't really think about putting a justice and equity lens on it. So the new conservation proposals coming forward basically follow the Jimenez principles and say that you need to go out and reach out to these communities and engage them early and get their thoughts and find out what they want to see as the future of this land, and then try to work cooperatively with them. So the way that the Bears Ears National Monument was established basically was co-produced and now would be co-managed by 5 different local indigenous tribes and the federal government working together with the conservation community. And that's the new model we want to have for conservation going forward for this next 500 million acres. Next slide. So again, here's the goal that we have. This is just dealing with America's land and not looking at the water side, but we want to protect 30% by 3030. Next slide. So how do you get there? Here's the pie chart, and it's looking at where the real opportunities lie. And it basically says if you want to get to 30%, the biggest chunk is looking at the Bureau of Land Management federal lands, the public lands that are managed by the BLM, because it's got the most land, it's got the most land that is unprotected, and it's got the most potential for adding to the overall goal. After that, the next big one are the national forests managed by the Forest Service. And then you start looking at much smaller segments. You know, the Department of Defense basically has no protected land. We're not talking about changing Nellis Air Force Base, but, you know, they do have desert bombing ranges and things like that that could be protected for wildlife and be added to the nature needs half thing. But right now they have no conservation commitment to those lands. Fish and Wildlife Service lands are largely protected already, as are national parks, but there's still some more that could be done with the Fish and Wildlife Service lands. Just think of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, where they want to go drill the whole thing, and the Trump administration, working with the Alaska delegation, have opened it up, and now we're trying to close it again. But the other big chunk, and where groups like Save Mount Diablo can be so helpful, is looking at state and local government lands and looking at the private lands and seeing what can be added there. Because you can see between lands that are already in state and local government hands, and then private lands that could be managed in a much more conservation oriented way, you're suddenly dealing with, you know, 20% or more of the land. So key takeaways on the right: federal lands represent the biggest opportunity, 69%. After that, state, local, non-federal at 31%. And if you do all that, you can then achieve the goal we have, which is 500 million more acres of land on top of the 250 plus that we've already got protected. Okay, next slide. So this tries to show you unit by unit how much is protected and how much is still potentially available. So the bar graph in the far left says Bureau of Land Management. The dark green are the BLM wilderness areas and areas of critical environmental concern and BLM wilderness study areas that are already semi-protected. And the light green is the 90% of the BLM lands that aren't protected, that are really the targets of opportunity because they haven't been strip mined or completely destroyed, and there's real opportunity to add them up to the 30%. The Forest Service has a higher percentage of lands that are protected, primarily as wilderness. But again, there's huge potential on the national forests where they aren't already devastated and destroyed through clear cutting, where we could turn around and add more to the 30%. Department of Defense, again, it's wide open, but they don't really control that much land area. Fish and Wildlife Service, as I said, most is already protected, but we need to finish the job there. And then if you look at the others, there's a lot of potential that lies there. Next slide. And if you do all that, the yellow line there shows you get over 30%. So I mentioned the US Geological Survey and their understanding that 12% is presently protected. Well, what do they mean by protected? Well, it means it's in either status 1 or status 2. So status 1 are those areas that are protected from conversion as natural lands, and they don't really have disturbing activities taking place in them. So think of Yellowstone National Park or the Yosemite backcountry, or, you know, the John Muir Wilderness, you know, whatever it is. Estate wilderness would be another one that would fit that particular category. Status 2 is slightly less protected. So they're permanently protected from conversion of natural land cover, but they may get some management practices on them. So this might be a nature conservancy preserve like Ring Mountain or something like that. Or, some of the lands, I don't know how all the lands that Save Mount Diablo manages that ultimately they wish to transfer, that, what kind of practices take place on there. But, certain practices don't necessarily take it out of the protected range. If you get into status 3 and status 4, it's basically land that's marginally useful. And so that's the definitions that they use. Okay, next slide. So I want to show you some of the different ways that one could reach this audacious goal. So again, I mentioned that the Bureau of Land Management is the biggest opportunity, where about 10% is protected, 90% is unprotected. And of that 90%, they're all open to oil and gas leasing and drilling and other extractive activities. And so if you took some of these policy strategies, which are in blue in the lower right-hand corner, or you did a moratorium on new oil and gas leasing, or you did mineral withdrawals so they couldn't be doing any more hard rock mining out in most of those areas. You have new national monument designations, like we did for Giant Sequoia National Monument, Grand Staircase Escalante, the Bears Ears, some of the California coastal national monuments. The establishment of new wildlife and recreation areas, or congressional action like on wilderness bills or oil and gas reforms. So those kinds of things could all really bring up that 90% number from the BLM lands. But the same is true for the Forest Service, for the Department of Defense, and for the Fish and Wildlife Service. You would want to use these kind of strategies for those lands. Okay, next slide. Here's an example of how big a chunk one could get. Totally protected Forest Service lands, national forests right now, are about 50 million acres. The potential out there of what more could be protected is 140 plus million acres. There's something called the roadless rule. And in the final month of the Clinton administration, the conservation community pressured them to ultimately complete a rule which said that roadless areas that don't have roads in them, don't have clear cuts in them, don't have mines in them, and are generally wild and great for biodiversity and great for carbon sequestration ought to be protected as roadless unless they are specifically opened. And that, with a stroke of the pen after a very exhaustive public participation process, ended up temporarily protecting 60 million acres. But then every time since the Clinton administration and the roadless rule was adopted by them, every time a Republican president gets in there, they try to undo the roadless rule and say, we don't really need to protect these areas. And so as a result, we've really only protected about 8 million of them, which means that there's roughly 50 million acres of roadless land, 2% of the US overall land mass, that one could protect if you permanently adopted the roadless rule. So we have legislation in Congress to try to make sure that it won't flip-flop with each administration, but instead we could actually fully protect these roadless areas and protect them in perpetuity. And again, that would add 2% towards that 30% goal. Next slide. So Ted talked about the climate crisis and how it's linked to protecting land and protecting biodiversity. This little graph here, the dark line at the top called business as usual, is where carbon emissions are going if we don't change our basic practices and burning so many fossil fuels and continuing the consumption patterns we have globally. It leads to an uninhabitable world. It leads to probably 60% extinction rates. It leads to even more frequent wildfires and tornadoes and flooding, if you can imagine it. I mean, basically all of southern Florida would be underwater because of sea level rise. all of half of Berkeley and half of San Francisco would be under sea level rise. You don't want business as usual. So everybody's pretty familiar with the traditional mitigation technologies that are being promoted, basically saying, let's use less energy, let's use it more efficiently, let's conserve, let's ride bicycles and drive less, let's fly less, let's put in a bunch of solar and wind and phase out oil and gas and coal. And if you do all that, you basically get this gray wedge. And the gray wedge gets you down close to, but not at, a path towards 2 degrees Celsius increase. Now, 2 degrees Celsius increase is not sufficient to protect biodiversity. It's not sufficient to head off extreme weather. And the International Governmental Panel on Climate Change basically said that to really do the kind of protection that would be necessary, you shouldn't increase global mean temperatures by more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is that bottom blue line. But the only way that you can get down to 1.5 degrees Celsius is if you not only deploy all that solar, all that wind, all that energy conservation, stop burning fossil fuels, but also you figure out how to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and store it in plants and store it in soil and store it in rocks. You hear about 350.org. 350 refers to 350 degrees Celsius, 350 degrees Fahrenheit, 350 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, I'm sorry. And right now we're at 410. You need to get down below 350, substantially below, in order to be on that 1.5 degrees Celsius track. And the only way to do that is to get this long-lived carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and stop putting more up into the atmosphere. And to do that, you basically got to do a lot of land protection as well as some technological things. But if you don't do the carbon removal, you can't get there. And so the more we trash land and turn it from a carbon sink into a carbon source, the worse the case the situation is. On the other hand, if we can restore land and make it so it's sucking up and storing more carbon, then we're getting towards the curve that we need to be at to head off the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis. Okay, next slide. And here's one good way you can do it: carbon dense national forests. So if you look at this map of the United States, excluding Hawaii, the dark green are basically the areas where there are super carbon dense forests. And those ought to all be protected so that that carbon can be locked up in perpetuity. Yeah, sure, some of it will burn up in a wildfire, but it helps if you aren't turning around and cutting it all down and sending it to a sawmill. And now if you look on the right of these bar charts, you see that all forests are not created equal. The Tongass National Forest, the last item there, the one that's sticking way out below 10 million acres, is the hugest carbon dense forest reserve. It is our rainforest. And right now, you know, the Trump administration was busy trying to open up clear cutting there again. And now we're urging the Biden-Harris administration to basically shut it down and keep that as a big carbon reserve. But you can go through the list of forests here, and you know, there finally is the Sierra Forest up near the top as one of the top 25, but it's a relatively minuscule amount. But one of the things the Sierra Club has in mind, along with the rest of the conservation community, is to basically set up a national forest carbon reserve and basically say that certain national forests, like the Tongass and like parts of the Sierra, ought to be protected as national carbon reserves. So they may not qualify as wilderness or national park, but nevertheless, we shouldn't be having logging and roading taking place in those areas, because the highest and best use is to make sure that they're sucking up carbon and sequestering it on a permanent basis. Next slide. So here's another big chunk. As I mentioned, 90% of the BLM lands are the opportunity to really get to that 30% goal. And the biggest opportunity right now out there is America's Red Rock Wilderness Act, which is basically protecting the canyon lands, the Red Rock Wilderness of southeastern Utah. And if you do that, it would add 9 million acres towards our goal of 500 million acres. So it's about 0.4% of the US land mass. But again, it's a huge chunk. And if we just try to protect 20,000 acres here and 10,000 acres there, we're never going to get to our goal. So we also have to look at some big opportunities in order to make this happen. Next slide. Now, another way is looking at energy production coming off our public lands. So this bar chart, ignoring line 5, are basically the emissions coming from all the major polluting countries in the world. So there's China as the biggest emitter. United States used to be the biggest emitter. Now we've been taken over. India is quickly catching up with us. Russia, Japan, there's Indonesia. Now, the reason this slide is up here is not just to look at how all these countries need to get their emissions down to net zero, but look at the line 5, US public lands. That's how much emissions are coming out of the oil and gas and coal that is produced on our public lands. And if we were to stop using our public lands as a source for more polluting fossil fuels and instead said, these are going to be off limits, we could in fact reduce US emissions by that much. And so that would be another huge way. So when we talk about different things we need to do, stopping more oil and gas and coal leasing on BLM lands, on Fish and Wildlife Service lands like they want to do in the Arctic Wildlife Refuge, on Forest Service lands like they want to do in the Los Padres Forest and the Sierra Forest. Those are all important things to do. Next slide. This is a set of really complicated maps, but I'm not going to walk you through everything. I just want to show you how complex this is when you're trying to figure out where your opportunities are and why you shouldn't just concentrate in one area alone. The upper left one, ecological integrity, the dark green are the areas that have the most ecological integrity. No surprise, it's mostly in the West. It's mostly beyond the 100th meridian. So that if you look at the upper Midwest, you look at the South, you look at the Eastern Seaboard, there's not a whole lot of ecological integrity there. Look at the next map, B on the upper right, connectivity. So this refers to the fact that if you've got an area protected and there's another area, you want some kind of connectivity so that whether it's mountain lions or grizzly bears or gray wolves, or frankly, birds and everything else, how do they get from one area to another to migrate, to adapt for climate change, but also just to survive and flourish? And again, the super high connectivity potential lies primarily west of the 100th meridian. And for most of the Midwest and the Eastern Seaboard and whatever, you don't really have a lot of potential there. But now look at the lower left, ecosystem representation priority. That says that if you look at the Sierra Nevada in California, for example, it's already pretty well represented as far as having a number of areas that are saved and protected. Where if you look at the Central Valley or the Sierra foothills or the Diablo Range or the California coastal shrub, those are the areas that are much less protected. And then if you look at areas out in the prairies, Iowa, Nebraska, and everywhere else, you've really got very little ecosystem representation. There's a couple little nature conservancy preserves. There may be a little bit of land trust land there somewhere. But, basically, it's all been turned to corn or put under houses. Then go look at the lower right, biodiversity priority. If Nature Needs Half is designed to try to head off the extinction crisis is most severe in those red hotspots. And so there you can see is the Florida Panhandle. There's the Appalachian core. There's some of the Virginia, South Carolina, North Carolina coast. But look at California. Yes, we've done a good job of protecting the California desert and the Sierra Nevada, but there's other huge parts of California where there's huge biodiversity potential, and we don't really have the kind of protection that's necessary and the amount of land protected to really make sure that biodiversity will thrive in the future. So again, it's not enough to just say, oh, we met our acreage target in California, we got to 30%, but we did it by just adding some more high Sierra forest. we need to really concentrate on the areas that have the connectivity needs and the biodiversity needs and the ecological integrity needs, instead of just looking at which is the easiest land to go save in order to get your acreage sum total up. Next slide. So I'm near the end, ready for questions, but if you succeed with this, you are mitigating the climate crisis by, as Ted said, basically, whenever you protect land, you're storing a lot of carbon in the process. You're helping wildlife migrate and adapt to changing ecosystems by getting these corridors protected. So think of what Save Monte Diablo and the Sierra Club are doing about Tesla Park. This is a key wildlife migration corridor for the Diablo Range. And yet, if this is turned into an off-highway vehicle park, it's basically going to block the kind of migration that's necessary for the wildlife to migrate back and forth, as well as basically taking a wild area that ought to be part of 30 by 30 and trashing it. I mean, if you're going to have a playground for off-highway vehicles, let's go pick some area that doesn't have, strong biodiversity and wildlife habitat and connective corridor potential, instead of picking an area that is absolutely vital for that. So hopefully when this is all over, you'll get excited about a campaign like Save Tesla Park and get involved in that. Stopping fossil fuel extraction on the public lands. We can't just do it on the public lands, but that's a good place to start, because it's very difficult to turn around and tell private landowners in Pennsylvania that you can't sell your oil and gas rights. You'd have to turn around and basically buy them all out. But the public land resource already belongs to us. There's no reason we should be giving it away to the oil and gas companies for a song. And then trying to basically create more public lands and parks in urban areas. Again, it gets to this idea of the equity deficit and the fact that we can't just get this 30 by 30 out of remote wilderness areas. We also need to be protecting areas close by to urban areas to deal with disadvantaged communities, but also the urban wildlife that are associated with it, because that's going to improve the health and wellness of people when they have that connection with nature. And again, if we're doing this in a just and equitable way, following the Jimenez principles, then hopefully the Native American community and others who have historically stewarded this land and have a deep connection to it are also feeling like it's working for them, and the solutions that we've come up with respect their interests and their sovereignty. Close to last slide. Is there another one? Does this have 2 clicks on it? Yeah, well, do 4 clicks. Sorry, because I just want to rush through this. But this just indicates that it's not just enough from our standpoint in the Sierra Club. We've now identified 4 levels of power that you need to work at. The first one is just advocating for individual redress. So if they want to do an off-highway vehicle park in Tesla Park, we want to stop them from doing that. That's advocating for the individual redress. The winning policies thing is something bigger. It says that if in fact you could get a new roadless rule for all the national forests to protect 50 million acres, if you could get a ban on all oil and gas and coal leasing on public lands, that's a big winning policy. And as a result, it is going to protect far more than just one individual area. Structural power talks about changing the playing field, but sometimes the playing field is so weighted against you that you can't really do the kind of protection that you need. For example, it is prohibited by federal law to ever designate a national monument in the state of Wyoming. It's the only state that's like that. But after we succeeded in getting Grand Teton designated as a national monument, the Wyoming delegation went in and said, there can never be another national monument in Wyoming. That makes it very difficult to go protect land there, particularly when the entire Wyoming congressional delegation doesn't want to ever protect another acre, and they think there's too much and they want to privatize all the land. So structural power change basically talks about changing the playing field. How can you go change the rules of the game so that these right-wing anti-conservation people in power in Wyoming aren't the only ones that dictate the future of the public lands in Wyoming that belong to all of us? And the final level of power is the hardest one, the one that takes the longest term to go deal with, but it's basically addressing changing values and beliefs and narratives. that if people don't understand why it's important to protect nature and what's in it for them, then they're unlikely to try to figure out any way that they want to be involved in doing it. On the other hand, if they believe that protecting nature is either their religious responsibility, or there's something in it for their basic survival, or it's just what, was meant in order to try to go make sure that the world is a good place to live to pass on to our grandkids. But you need to kind of change the narrative. So you need to get people believing that there is a biodiversity crisis and it needs to be dealt with, that there's great value in government, that there's great value in addressing the climate change, and we'll all benefit if we do, and we'll all suffer, and perhaps suffer in major ways, certainly suffer in major ways if we don't address it. So that's the kind of bigger power of changing those kinds of basic beliefs. And you really need to work on all these. You can't just work on one and ever hope to get another 500 million acres of protected land. Slide. So right now, the real opportunities with a new administration in Washington are getting the Biden administration to follow through on its commitments on 30 by 30, on no fossil fuel leasing on public lands, on a whole bunch of other things related to environmental justice and equity, and then also the kind of congressional actions that go with it. So not only do we need President Biden and Harris to make sure there isn't any logging on the Tongass forest, but we also need to pass the legislation so that the next occupant of the White House doesn't undo that, and instead it becomes a matter of permanent federal law. And then state-based approaches. So everything we can be doing at that level. And there's real opportunities now when the state is committed to 30 by 30 to basically say, how can you be doing 30 by 30 and at the same time promoting things like trashing Tesla Park? And then third, reversing and permanently protecting areas that were undone by the Trump administration. So where they undid the monuments in Grand Staircase Escalante or in Bears Ears, and some of the other things they did, basically rushing in order to lease the Arctic Wildlife Refuge. We need to go undo all of those. Okay, next slide. And that's it. This just is a pitch for the Sierra Club, which partners with Save Mount Diablo and others, but the things we're bringing to the table. I mean, it's important to have local partners that really focus on the things that you do, because we don't have those connections and that commitment and those resources. But at the same time, if we're going to get to 30 by 30, both nationally and globally, you've got to have a Sierra Club there that can operate in all 50 states and have chapters in every locality, and have an international program and have lots of trained volunteers that take people to these areas and help protect them. So that's my end, but I just want to thank Save Mount Diablo for caring about this issue, for committing to this issue, for having done this work long before there was anything called 30 by 30, just not recognizing it as that, and weighing in even more and saying we've got to double down if we're going to succeed by 2030. So I'm going to open this up for questions, and thank you all.
Okay, thank you so much. It was an excellent presentation, and we have a couple questions in the chat box. Anyone else that has a question for Bruce, please type it into the chat box and we will get to it as soon as we can. So of course, the first question is from Ted, our executive director, of course, and he was wondering, what do you think explains the fact that we have known that the science on human-caused climate change for decades, the causes and solutions, but have not yet substantially addressed the threat? There seems to be some underlying disconnect that needs to be resolved first.
Well, I think the disconnect is that our politics are broken. That basically combination of campaign finance reform, who runs for office, gerrymandering so that the popular vote doesn't really represent who gets into power, whether it's in the White House or the Congress or the state legislatures, and then having a certain political party basically in the pocket of the oil and gas industry that doesn't want to let go of this. You know, they basically make their living off these reserves. And if they were told you can't burn anymore going forward, their whole business model collapses. And furthermore, all that investment collapses. So they want to keep leasing more land and they want to keep burning it till, it's all gone. And that just can't happen. But if they can wield enough power so that suddenly, they control enough people and feed them stuff through the right-wing media that climate change is a hoax, that it's going to cost you, that you're no longer going to be able to drive, you're no longer going to be able to eat meat, you're no longer going to be able to go on vacations because these, environmentalists are basically trying to take away all the fun in your life. And furthermore, there's no reason to do it because everything's been fine for the last 5 generations and everything will be fine for the next 5 generations. And which story would you rather hear? And so, in the last election, 75 million people decided they were going to vote for Donald Trump and vote for continuing, the bad policy of basically saying we aren't going to be involved in the Paris Climate Accord. We're going to lease oil and gas to everybody. We're going to loosen all the standards. We aren't going to ban fracking. And, furthermore, we're going to basically take all the money away from the Park Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service and lease all their lands to be developed too. And, the fact that 75 million Americans would turn around and say, that's okay with us, we want this guy, tells us we've got a lot of public education to do, but also we basically have to change our basic democracy and take it back so that it is really representative. Because in California, we don't have the kind of gerrymandered redistricting. We've got independent drawing of boundaries for congressional districts. But if you look at what they're trying to do in all the other red states, I mean, it's just appalling to basically lock in their power so that the public is never really represented. And, people, I mean, it's interesting, like the politics in Florida right now. Okay, there's a state that, marginally went for Trump. But right now they're facing so many climate crises that even Ron DeSantis, who plans to be the next Donald Trump, is recognizing that climate change is real and that if he's going to either, run for president or become another second-term governor, he's got to figure out how to address climate change and how to talk about it in a reasonable way. And I think that's slowly moving in the right direction. I mean, the Republican Climate Caucus is pathetic. And every time there's somebody who's serious about it, they get challenged from the right and told that, they aren't Trumpy enough. So I don't know how long it's going to take to make that conversion, but just contact your relatives, your friends, any associate and tell them climate change is real. You got to be active. It threatens you. This isn't just some quirk that suddenly, all the fires are happening and all the tornadoes are happening and all the floods are happening. And the last 8 years, I've had 8 of the last 10 years have been the hottest ones on record.
Okay, here's another question. And what is the role for a carbon tax or something similar? For example, to include it in the market prices, the funds to offset the damage caused?
Well, what is the prospect trying to get it through the Congress? The word tax is basically, the third rail of politics back there. But if you look at what the Democratic leadership is now negotiating on a potential budget deal that would be pushed forward with reconciliation this fall, it includes some kind of price on carbon. I don't know exactly what it'll be because it hasn't been written. If you look at what the European Union just came up with, where they basically said, we're going to have a import carbon fee so that if people produce high carbon cement or steel or aluminum in another country and try to bring it into the European Union, we're going to add a tax to it so that our companies that are going to produce low carbon construction materials aren't going to be disadvantaged. The US could do the same thing. So I think there's ways to structure this that would work. And frankly, it's going to take a combination of price on carbon and regulation to basically say there's certain things you can't do, and then subsidies and carrots to turn around and try to encourage more people to save energy and set higher standards for efficiency and, give subsidies to people for the conversion to electric vehicles and solar and wind and banning gas and stoves. I mean, just all the things need to take place. It won't just work with a market. And, again, depending on how you do the market, it can either turn around and backfire or it can go forward. When they put a carbon price in Australia, it turned around and then led to a whole bunch of Trumpy prime ministers coming in after that and saying it was all garbage and they're costing you. I mean, same what Macron was doing. He wanted to raise the price of gas in France. Suddenly he's got the yellow vest community coming after him and he has to back off the whole thing. So I just don't think that markets are the main way to go if you're really trying to get the public on your side, but you can't take it out of your tool chest.
I have a comment from Celeste Garamendi. Hello, Bruce and participants. I am Celeste Garamendi, one of the many advocates for saving Tesla Park. Thank you for your presentation and comments on Tesla. As Bruce mentioned, Tesla Park is a perfect case in our backyard, calling for the need to actually preserve public lands and not pretend that by definition public lands are preserved. In the case of Tesla, sadly, in spite of the proclamations by the governor, he has thus far opposed preserving Tesla by a veto in 2019 and threatened line item veto in the budget just a few weeks ago. So advocacy is needed even in California Democratic administration.
Amen. Couldn't have said it better. She knows it much more intimately than I, and she's got the politics head on. I mean, everything one can do to put pressure on Gavin Newsom. I don't know what's going on there. The fact that he would line item veto this means there's some political deal going on. And, basically there's two kinds of power. There's people power and there's money power. And somehow the money power is speaking there. And we just got to assert the people power in order to overcome it. And, hopefully he'll respond to that when he understands that it's not just a couple environmental wackos with Save Mount Diablo and the Sierra Club, but in fact, the public doesn't want this to happen. And he's got a responsibility if he's really serious about being a conservation leader and promoting 30 by 30, and he has any aspirations for higher office. Let's get consistent.
Here's a good one. So can fully conserved land still allow carefully managed hunting and pasturing of stock?
Yeah, I mean, the National Wilderness Preservation System has grazing that is guaranteed by right by law. It says grazing where it presently exists shall continue. And, those lands are considered in, the highest category 1 protection. Now, sometimes there's overgrazing, and where there's overgrazing, it needs to be regulated. But the fact that there is a moderate level of grazing and it's not wiping out water holes or destroying the riparian area or eroding the soil and losing the soil carbon. Most of our landscapes evolved with large ungulates, and having some large ungulates that happen to be domesticated rather than wild doesn't necessarily ruin the overall thing. It's still fine for biodiversity and it's still fine, but if it's overgrazed, then it's not. So, I mean, cattle can be extremely destructive, and you see that particularly in the Bureau of Land Management lands where they get less than 10 inches of rainfall a year and the water holes are very limited. And so, cattle destroying them can destroy the wildlife potential of it. So I'm not a big advocate for any kind of abusive grazing, and it's got to be strongly regulated. And also there ought to be a bunch of areas that are unsuitable for grazing. So, those particular areas we need to get the cows off of, but they don't need to be off all land in order to reach the 30% goal.
Here's another one. How do red rock lands help this effort? Is there enough vegetation there to help?
Yes, and it's not just a matter of the vegetation. If you are looking at soil carbon sequestration, then you don't want to disturb the soil. And desert soils actually store a lot of carbon. But if you run an off-road vehicle and break that desert crust, the cryptobiotic soils, then it all erodes away and all that carbon's gone. But there's lots of critters that live out in the desert. What do they live on? Well, they live a little bit on cactus, they live a little bit on mesquite. There isn't much vegetation, and the wildlife is sparser as the vegetation is sparser. But there's also huge amounts of biodiversity. The Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance, which is one of the main local groups working with the Sierra Club for the Red Rocks wilderness proposal, recently contracted with EcoAdapt, looking at how the Red Rocks wilderness proposal would in fact store lots of carbon and provide connectivity for wildlife and preserve biodiversity in the process. And if you contact SUA, you can get a copy of that study, but it's really indicative of the fact that we can't just be looking at the carbon-rich forests and think that that solves the problem. I mean, acre for acre, if you only could protect 1 acre, you would want to do the Tongass and not Grand Staircase if you're only interested in carbon. But if you're interested in biodiversity, you can't just do the Tongass either. So we need it all.
We have one from our own Seth Adams. Bruce, why are you so optimistic that we'll address and solve these issues?
Well, I don't know if optimism is the right word, but I have hope. And I think hope is what thrives and makes me move forward on this. I mean, optimism is not blind and just said, we're going to get there, don't worry. You know, I mean, when I first looked at this and I said, 500 million acres over the next 9.5 years, how in the world could one possibly do that? I've spent my entire career in this effort. And I think, well, because of the Alaska Lands Act, you know, I helped to save probably 180 million acres, but that's still nowhere close to what needs to be done. And that was over 4 decades. But on the other hand, not as many people were involved, and it wasn't staring us in the face like it is now. So the combination of the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis, and the fact that it's not just E.O. Wilson, but it's now the G7, and it may well soon be the International Convention on Biodiversity in Kunming, if they all start saying, this is real, this needs to happen now, there's a crisis, the 6th mass extinction is facing us, and it's going to be really bad, not only for the wildlife, but for humankind, that's going to motivate people. And so it may be just the kick in the pants that's needed so that we stop doing foolish things like leasing more oil and gas or destroying wild areas with off-highway vehicle parks.
Yeah. And we have one last question here. How did the ACE Act ever get passed and signed off by the president?
Well, several things. One had to do with politics, that there were 2 endangered Republican senators, one from Colorado, Cory Gardner, and the other from Montana, that both wanted to appear to be strong conservationists because their constituency was strong conservationist. And so they basically went to the Trump administration and pled and said, hey guys, I need this. And similarly, there were a bunch of other Republicans that, you know, weren't going to go support us on climate change or a number of other things, but, you know, we're perfectly willing to support the Land and Water Conservation Fund. At the same time, you've got fish and wildlife agencies all across the country that depend on this. They've got wildlife action plans. They're looking for money coming down so that they can buy more deer winter range or new boat access things or whatever it is. There's a whole bunch of, you know, city governments that are interested in it. So there's so many more stakeholders. If this was just money that turned around and was coming earmarked for buying up private land to make new national parks, it never would have flown. And right now, you know, I don't know necessarily that Trump really knew what he was supporting. He just looked at the politics and said, hey, this is an easy thing. And then I can turn around and say I'm the environmental president because I made this happen. You know, the other thing you have to understand is this is a real devil's bargain. The money that fills that up comes from offshore oil leasing. And if you stop the offshore oil leasing in the Gulf of Mexico and off the coast of the Atlantic and the Pacific, as we want to have happen, then suddenly you don't have anything filling up the pot, providing that 900 million acres, $900 million a year to then go get distributed. So if the only way to turn around and buy new land is to turn around and trash offshore, it's not a good deal. So ultimately, you know, there needs to be a different funding formula that takes place there. So this is not the end solution, and it's not the greatest environmental victory that ever took place. And, you know, frankly, there were a bunch of people from Louisiana and elsewhere that were willing to vote for this, even though they're big fossil fuel fiends. And it's because they knew this was going to keep the spigots going, both on the offshore oil drilling And then they get some money that's coming back that they can use for, you know, a catfish fishing ramp or something. What's not to like about that?
Well, I think that those are all the questions for right now. I cannot thank you enough for this. This is a timely and really interesting presentation, and for all the work that you have done in the past, but all the work that you have continued to do and what you have ahead of you. We wish you a lot of success and hope to see you again and stay connected with you. And thank you to everyone who joined tonight. And we will be sending out an email with a recording of this presentation. And so you will be able to receive that and watch it again. And thank you, Bruce. We can't thank you enough.
Okay, go save Mount Diablo. You do
We will
wonderful
do
work.
that. Yes.
All right.
Thank you.
Everybody join, everybody give.
All right. Thank you, Bruce.